Hi, everybody. Very welcome to yet another episode of the Captain Speaking podcast. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt, and you probably know me from my YouTube channels, Mentor Pilot, Mentor Now, and maybe even mentorpilot.com. And together with me, I have
Ben Watts. You know me from Airline Pilot Performance and also a co-host on Mentor Now.
Yeah. So great to have you back here again, Ben.
It's good to be back.
It's I love hanging out and talking to you, especially in times like this, because we are in a very difficult time right now. If we're talking from an aviation point of view,
Yeah.
I don't know about how your week has been so far, but for me, it's been crazy.
I can imagine.
There's so much fear and uncertainty out there. There's so many people that are confused about what happened to Air India Flight 171, which is what we're going to dedicate this episode to. And I understand it. I completely understand that when things like this happen, especially to a modern aircraft like that, there are a lot of questions. And when there are a lot of questions, there's going to be a lot of people with answers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is what we are going to be dedicating this podcast to, like what you can and should be listening to and what you shouldn't be listening to, and what all of these fringe theories and stuff that are out there are actually coming from. But before we get to that, how's your week been?
Yeah, it's been busy. It's been dominated by what's been in the news. I've been doing a lot of flying over the last week, and obviously in the flight deck, we're talking about it. I've noticed the passengers as well, like when I'm doing the walk around outside the aircraft, passengers are nervous, and I think with the news that's been going on over the last week, possibly more so. And I've had passengers. When you're doing a walk around, it's something we do every flight, and it's normal for us. It's routine. And a thorough walk around is what helps keep the operation safe, and we have to do it. But when maybe you're queuing outside the aircraft as a relatively nervous passenger, and you see the captain having a good look around stuff, it might go, oh God, what's he looking at? Why is he doing that? I've even had passengers say to me as I'm walking up the steps, "Oh, is everything all right, Captain? Is everything okay?" And you have to kind of reassure that, "Oh yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't be getting on if it wasn't, and it's what we do." But you can sense there is those nerves, understandably.
Yeah, no, and just like you're saying, I completely understand that reaction. If you don't have any insight into aviation and you don't know exactly what the procedures looks like, you would wonder, why does the captain stand there and stare up at the wing? Especially after something like this happened, when you're more alert. We humans are trained to look for threats in our environment. So if we see something and we don't really understand what it is that we're seeing, our minds are going to start playing games on us. And this is kind of what we are here, or at least that this is what I want this podcast to be kind of a guide to people that are into aviation. Maybe you're a nervous flyer, maybe you're really interested in aviation in general, or you want to become a pilot or whatever. I want us to be here to kind of help guide people on this path and explain things to people. This is why I started Mentor Pilot back in 2015 to do, right? This was the original thought behind the channel. So I'm super happy to have this vehicle now, this podcast, to be able to do so in a completely unscripted way.
Yep.
I mean, if we start with, again, a little bit what we know. The fact is that we don't know that much more this week than we did last week when we did our emergency live stream on Mentor Now and on this podcast. We know that on the 12th of June, 2025, that's almost exactly a week ago when this is being released, the Air India Flight 171 suffered a very tragic accident when flying out of Ahmedabad towards London Gatwick. We know that the aircraft that was involved was a Boeing 787-8 with two GEnx engines fitted to it. And we know that there was 230 people on board plus 12 crew members, so 242 in total. When it comes to people that got injured or deceased on the ground, we don't have the final number of that yet, unfortunately, because the aircraft, as we've seen on so many video clips now, took off and then started losing altitude pretty soon after the initial rotation. Maybe 400 feet, I think, more or less was the altitude that it reached. And then with its gear still extended, it just plowed into what is now, we know that there was a hotel for personnel working at the local hospital, I think.
Correct.
So we don't know what the total death count is. We know that it's horrendous. And our thoughts obviously goes out to friends, family, relatives to the perished people.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much what we know. We know that there was one survivor as well that has been interviewed, which forms part of some of the information that we are going to be talking about now in the coming 40 minutes or so. But one thing that I wanted to do before we get into all of this is I want to really emphasize why we're doing this, because there's a lot of discussions out there whether or not professionals should really even be talking about this. If we should just wait until the air accident investigators have done their job. And you see, I agree with that to a certain extent. Like, I agree with the fact that as professionals, we shouldn't be out there telling people this is likely what happened, or I think this happened, or I'm sure that this is what went on. But what I don't agree with is that we should stay quiet, because I think that in a moment like this, it's absolutely crucial that people like us go out and explain what all of these technical terms are. Because if we don't, then people out there, they're going to see this happening, and it's going to be a mystery to them. And all of these questions that automatically pops up that we've already talked about, they are just going to be left to fester. So what we are going to do now, and what we're continuously doing on my channels and your channel as well, is to try to explain the technical systems that are involved in the different theories that are swarming out there, and also to clearly point out what you can and cannot listen to when things like this happen. Because we are in an era now where news and fake news is being created on an industrial level, which is something that I just haven't seen before. And it just makes the situation even more confusing.
Yeah. And I think it's a good point that you raise about not saying nothing, because we're human, and human beings, when something huge happens like this that shakes an industry, all of us, whether we are experts on subject matter experts, or whether we have no idea, it doesn't really matter. We all have that. We go, what happened? How does that happen? Even before social media, when I was an instructor, like over 20 years ago, a friend of mine had a crash in a single engine light aircraft, and we don't know why, but we're in the flight school. We're all instructors, and you start talking about possible causes. The important thing is not to put it out there as fact, but I think as humans, we naturally want to understand what may have caused this.
Yeah.
And if we don't say anything, theories just start going off all over the place. And when I liken it to a completely different industry, such as medicine, one of my family members is not very well at the moment. And one of the very worst things is when we know nothing and no one says anything. Even if we're not given a definite answer, if we're given an understanding of what we're looking at here, we can start to process and start to understand. And I think it's very much the same here. And it's how we can learn. I think by coming up with ideas and looking at, well, could this have happened? We're forming potentials in our mind, which we can then maybe rely on later on down in our careers, because we've already kind of processed this, even if it wasn't what actually was the cause. So by coming out with facts and what we know and what we understand, and not speculating, it serves good. And I think that's what we're really here to try and do.
Yeah, at least that's what we're aiming for. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, before we get into the weeds of this, because there's quite a few points that we need to go through, I just want to do one thing as well. And first of all, to explain that the reason that you and I have the opportunity to sit here and talk about these things and to research it is that this podcast is actually being sponsored. Right, so we have a sponsor that is supporting the job that we do, and I just wanted to point that out, because some people might think that it's not good form to include a sponsor in an episode like this. But the fact is that we need their support in order to have the production team behind us to help us to produce these kind of things. And to be honest, when we're talking about things like, for example, fake news and websites that you cannot trust and things like this. It's actually a pretty relevant sponsor to have as well. So before we get into the kind of meat of the program, I just want to say hello to our sponsor and thank you.
Now, if you haven't guessed it already, the sponsor I was talking about is NordVPN, one of my oldest, most loyal sponsors of all my channels. Normally, I would now go into the excellent features Nord offers, but that just didn't feel right for this episode. So instead, I would just tell you that I do use NordVPN, and so does my entire family. You see, we live in Andorra, which is outside the EU, and that means that we sometimes need a reliable VPN for things like watching sports or movies, and for dealing with Spanish authorities, as they strangely sometimes only allow IP addresses from Spain. With one single account, you can use it on up to 10 different devices, which means that your entire family can. And it comes with several great cybersecurity features, which is becoming increasingly important in today's complicated world. So to support this podcast and start using a service that at least Ben and I find genuinely useful, scan this QR code or go to nordvpn.com/captain. That's nordvpn.com/captain. That will give you 4 extra months when you sign up for the 2-year deal, and Nord will always give you a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you don't really risk anything by trying. Thank you, Nord. Now let's continue.
Okay, so we're back again. Let's start by going through point by point what we have learned so far, and also what we haven't learned so far. So if you wanna take this off.
Okay, yeah. So there's a lot of if, buts, and maybes out there, but if we stick to what we can see so far, and just to kind of, and we'll take each point in turn later on. But the first thing we know is that the aircraft appears to get airborne normally. Until we get data that contradicts that, from the visuals, it looks like it gets airborne normally. We can see that the gear isn't retracted, because that normally happens a few seconds after takeoff. The gear stays down for the entire event. We see that it climbs away, and then the rate of climb gradually reduces until it turns into a descent. With the new footage that's come to light, the better quality footage, it seems that the ram air turbine was deployed, although that's not confirmed. We know now there was a Mayday call, and the Mayday call was thrust not achieved, falling, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Okay, so that's, if we kind of go through each bit there, that's kind of what we know so far in that sequence of events. So if we go through each point in turn now and just discuss this, from going back from what appears to get normal, it gets airborne normally. Let's kind of thrash this out now and what that means.
So and also, if we start with that getting airborne normally, right? So what do we mean by getting airborne normally?
Yeah, so getting airborne normally. So there's as we're accelerating down the runway, there's a point, as a lot of you will know, where a point of no return as such, where we call it V1, which is the lowest speed at which we can continue a takeoff safely and meet certain minimum climb gradients. It's also the maximum speed at which the first action to reject a takeoff needs to have happened by. So the fact that it got airborne tells us that everything must have been normal up to that point V1.
Yeah. So that we can say with pretty much certainty, because it's again, now we go back to all of the rubbish that is out there on social media, where people are talking about, well, maybe they took off with the flaps not extended and so on. And even though that is a possibility when you have certain system malfunctions, the likelihood that a modern airliner like the 787 is allowed to do that, as in it's that the pilots would do so, is pretty low, right? Yeah. Not out of the realm of possibility again, but pretty low. It's likely that the fact that they got to V1 and they rotated and got airborne and actually climbed away initially would indicate that up until that point, probably things were looking okay. And I also want to mention here that there was a lot of initial information and confusion around the data, the ADS-B data that came out of apps like Flight Radar 24, for example, which initially people thought that they had taken off from midfield because they entered the runway at about halfway down the runway. That was then clarified to be, no, they backtracked and then they took off from there. It just had to do with the data points that Flight Radar 24 was showing to the public. But after that, there's also been discussions of whether or not they took off really, really late. We don't know.
No.
Without the flight data recorder readings, we don't know, because like Ben, you pointed out, we reach V1 and then you continue to accelerate. The fact that you reached V1, the decision speed, just means that you've decided to commit to the takeoff. And then you're gonna go to the rotation speed, which the pilot monitoring normally calls out, or the aircraft calls out. So V1, rotate, the rotation will start, and all of this time the aircraft is still on the ground. But it is now committed to the takeoff, so it's still eating runway below it, which means that you might see, it might look like the aircraft is taking off very, very late on a runway, but that is per design, right?
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts around that?
No, yeah, and also your eyes can play tricks on you, because what looks like absolutely, I mean, I've been on runways as you have as well, Peter, where there's like a hump in the runway. So as you're accelerating down the runway, all you see is the crest of the hump in front of you, which looks like the end of the runway. Now, of course, it isn't. But if you're at eye level standing on the ground and there is a slight hump, it can look like the aircraft is rotating right at the very end. But what you don't see is just beyond that is there's actually another kilometer of runway beyond it.
Yeah, but also I have been you know yourself, when you take off on really short runways with a high load, as in so that you're close to the maximum takeoff weight that you're allowed. When you rotate, it really the end of the runway just disappears below you.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, and that's still okay by design. Now, again, that is not to say that there might not have been something, and this is the problem that we have right now. The problem is that from last week when we did our first podcast until now, there has literally been almost no information released from official sources. Like, they've said that they've found one survivor, which they've interviewed. They've said that they've found the combi recorder, right? There's a flight data recorder and a cockpit voice recorder normally on board an aircraft. The 787 is a really modern aircraft, so it is equipped with something called combi recorders, which means that each one of these boxes contains both of these functions. So you only need to find one of them in order to find both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. So we know that they found them, and the last I heard was that it's been sent off to be read.
Yeah.
And that also means that between the time we record this and this is released, it's about 2 days. And there is a small chance that they might have actually found or read out the recorders by that time. And if that's the case, then that information is going to come in here. And if that wasn't the case, then we're still waiting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the other thing I think it means as well, with regards to the takeoff, that when the only kind of data point that we've got to compare this to is a Spanair crash back in Madrid, when we're talking about flaps. So there's a lot of talk about flaps not being set for takeoff. We covered that in the live stream with takeoff config warnings and so on. And the fact that it appears to rotate and get airborne normally is very, very different to the footage we have of the Spanair crash. So again, the fact that it does get initially airborne normally tells us that it's very unlikely that the flaps were not set for takeoff, particularly when you combine that with the fact that there's modern takeoff config warnings, checklists, and so on. Now, of course, it's not impossible, but what we're seeing on the footage would not correspond with that.
Yeah, and here it's also super important to point out that what you see on a video taken by someone's mobile phone somewhere might not be up to the quality required in order to visually confirm flap settings, right? Yeah. And even if it's very high quality, I think we have some pictures here that can show that even with very high quality cameras at a pretty close range, at least the trailing edges, when it's set to flaps 1 or flaps 5, is almost indistinguishable. It is very, very hard to make out that. You can see the slats, which is the part on the leading edges of the wings, the front of the wings. Those ones are generally more easy to see. But it's super hard to pick them up. And I think this is the reason why a lot of people initially were out there guessing that it was a flapless takeoff. But we cannot, from what we have, from what we see, you cannot have that absolutely confirmed.
No. But it appears to get airborne normally, and then once the aircraft gets airborne on a normal takeoff, the very next thing that will happen is that we get a positive rate of climb. So the pilots will look at the altimeter and your vertical speed indicator to confirm that yes, indeed, we are climbing away from the ground. We would say positive rate, and that will come with the response from the pilot flying, gear up.
Yeah.
And once we get the gear up, that cleans the aircraft up so that we've got minimal drag now. The gear's done its job, we're climbing away. That didn't happen. Well, at least the gear didn't come up.
No.
Now, one interesting point here is I've spent some time going through the Boeing 787 CBT, which is a computer-based training that you do for your ground school when you're going to do a type rating, on the landing gear and brakes, the electrics and the hydraulics, to get a better understanding of how it differs from the 737 that we fly. And one thing that stood out to me is that once that gear is raised, one of the very, very first actions, so once the pilots move the gear lever from down to up, one of the very, very first actions that happens is the landing gear moves from because it's a double bogey, it's a 2-bogey system, so you've got 4 wheels. The gear is kind of pointed up. And if that's the direction of travel, the gear is pointing up. As soon as the gear lever is moved up, that truck system, that bogey system, is then hydraulically put into a nose down position, so that it's kind of toe down, and that's done so that it fits nicely into the undercarriage bay. And from the video that we see, and I know others have spotted this since I've looked at it, is that it appears that the bogey is nose down. That does seem very clear, because it's quite a marked change from where it was to where it ended. But then the very next thing that happens is the gear doors open. And it's clear to see that the gear doors weren't open, because they open up to allow the gear to retract into it. And that didn't happen. So all of these actions are done hydraulically. So what does that stand out to you, Peter? Does that kind of, I mean, if we're going to thrash this out?
Yeah, so again, the reason we're talking about this now is because we're now giving you technical details about this aircraft, right? This is a fact. What Ben just described to you is a part of the sequence for retracting a 787 landing gear, right? And why certain things happened or didn't happen, we don't know yet, okay? But of course, what stands out to me is the altitude where you can see that the aircraft starts losing altitude. Right, and that is corresponding to more or less where you would be when you start retracting the gear.
Yeah.
Right. This is why we in the first video that we did, we talked about what we had seen or what colleagues had seen in training, where someone had erroneously mistaken the flap lever for the gear, right? Because it's exactly where that happens. Now, that given all of the information that we see from these new videos and stuff, that seems less likely than what we talked about before again. But yeah, if what you're saying is true, and those that bogey started tilting down, the only reason that can happen is because the gear has been selected up.
Yes.
Right. And then it should continue with the doors opening and the gear starting to retract it. But that definitely did not happen. Nope. And this is exactly the time where the kind of parable of the flight starts pointing downwards. Yep. So that indicates potentially something to me. Again, this is why it's super hard to thread the needle here between giving you technical information about the aircraft, and speculating. And I don't want to be falling into the speculation camp. So we're just saying that if it actually did do that, then something happened around this time.
Yeah, and the fact that it was the gear, all of these actions that we're talking about, with the bogey being tilted nose down, the doors opening, the retraction, that's all hydraulically powered. And but the hydraulics power comes from electricity, because they're electric driven pumps. The fact that it began to happen and then stopped, it's fairly safe to say that either there was an electrical or hydraulic or both that prevented the remainder of that retraction from happening normally.
Yeah, because now we come to the next thing that has kind of, I'm not going to say be confirmed because it hasn't been confirmed, but with the amount of new videos that have become available with better sound quality.
Yeah.
One thing that stood out pretty early was the sound of the ram air turbine on those videos, because the ram air turbine, which is an automatic little, like a windmill, a 2-blade propeller that falls out of the fuselage in order to generate emergency electric and hydraulic power. The sound that makes it's very distinctive because those propellers will have to move at a very high speed in order to do the job that they're designed to do. That means that the edges of those propellers will reach close to the speed of sound or even past the speed of sound. And when they do, you have that really high-pitched propeller sound that comes through.
It sounds almost like a World War II airplane going past on a flyby, doesn't it?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
and I've been looking at different videos of other 787s that have been landing with the ram air turbine extended, and you can clearly hear that noise. Like, it's very, very distinctive. And if you compare that to what you can hear on those higher quality videos that have been released, it sounds similar, right?
Yeah.
So like here, let's play around and say that the ram air turbine was extended.
Yeah.
Right? Until we get that actually confirmed, we cannot say that that's a fact. What does that mean?
Sure. So from the ground school that I did with regards to the electrical and the hydraulic system, because the RAT is actually covered in both, because it does both, because as you mentioned, it's both a hydraulic pump by the way it spins, it's also a generator. Now, according to Boeing, the RAT will deploy automatically, so it's completely transparent to the pilot. The pilots won't do anything if any of the following conditions are met. So it's any one of these bullet points here. Starts off by saying both engines have failed. And you go, okay, well, why does that happen? Well, the engines are the primary source of electrical power, which then will then generate hydraulic pressure through the pumps. So if you lose that, the RAT will deploy. The 7.8 has 3 hydraulic systems. So if all 3 hydraulic system pressures are low.
Okay, so that's the second. That's the second reason, right? So dual engine failure, all 3 hydraulic systems are low.
Yeah. So if you lose all 3, the RAT will deploy as a fourth kind of electrical pump. The next one, loss of all electrical power to the captain and first officer's flight instruments. So they're vital for safety of flight. We need to see what we're doing, but if you lose all power to that, the RAT will deploy to power those. The next point is loss of all 4 electric motor pumps, which are hydraulic pumps, and a fault occurs in the flight control system on approach. Well, that's on the approach. And the last point that it notes is loss of all 4 electric motor pumps and an engine failure on takeoff or landing. So we see the RAT deployed, if that is confirmed, and it's looking more and more likely the more we see, then at least one of those conditions has to have been met.
Yeah. And it's super important to point out because, again, you'll find people out in social media saying that because the RAT was out, we have a dual engine failure. No. Because the RAT is out, that could be one of the reasons.
Yeah.
But there's also a multitude of other reasons that could cause it to deploy.
Yeah.
Right?
And, losing all of the electric motor pumps, which are the electric pumps that power the hydraulics, which will then pressurize landing gear and flaps. If they lost all 4 of them, then the RAT would deploy, and that's why maybe the gear didn't come up. But then you've got to ask the question, well, why? There's a lot of redundancy built into this. Why did they all 4, why did they fail? And you've got to look at that in the bigger picture of the aircraft then descending and ending up crashing. So, yeah.
So okay. So let's say that we know that the RAT is out, right? We now know. Now you're starting to have quite a few of these technical things kind of lined up. Then we get to the Mayday call, which we also did not know about in the first live stream that we did about this. And if you could repeat what that Mayday call was.
So the quote that was issued, and it changed. There was an initial one, and then it came out with a more recent one. And the most recent report says, and I quote, "Thrust not achieved, falling, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday."
Yeah.
Now that it's interesting. If that is true, that's the information we've got so far. Thrust not achieved is an interesting one. So if we go down the topic, again, I'm not speculating that it is a double engine failure at this stage, but thrust not achieved, that doesn't necessarily mean an engine failure. And an interesting point to me that I've noticed, I've looked at a couple of different angles, 2 angles that we've got on this, and compared that to other angles of engine failures. Something stood out to me that for the aircraft to fly the way it did, both engines, in my mind, would have had to have failed almost at the exact same time, because when you get an engine failure, you've got one engine producing high thrust, the other engine not. You get this immediate yaw.
Yeah.
And there's plenty of footage out there of aircraft having an engine failure. There's a great one of a 7.6 out of Prague. And you can clearly see the moment it happens, the aircraft does this. I can't detect any of that. There's a good angle from behind, there's an angle from the side on it, and I can't see any evidence of any kind of yaw, which to me tells me if there was a power loss, it happened at exactly the same time in a very similar fashion on both engines.
Which should be impossible. This is where, and I think probably this is why there's so many professionals out there speculating, because it just makes no sense.
No, and I think the interesting point for me is if this Mayday call is verified. To me, the word thrust not achieved is very different to when you look at the Hudson incident, where the Mayday that was declared on that, where they've lost both engines. Thrust not achieved means that they didn't achieve the thrust that they wanted. Doesn't mean that they've lost all of the power. So, the fact that they both roll back potentially simultaneously, if we are going down that road of that's why the rat deployed, that's why, and we look at what was called, it's an interesting phrase that to me that stood out. Thrust not achieved, because what we're saying by achieved is we have a target thrust that we will calculate and set. So when we set takeoff thrust, in my airline we say takeoff thrust set. Indications not. We're making sure that the thrust that we've calculated and need to safely take off is achieved. And then when we get airborne, if that was rolled back, maybe not to the point of idle, or below idle, but to the point that it couldn't sustain the weight of the aircraft. To me, that thrust not achieved is an interesting phrase to use in a very high stress, because you say what you see, don't you? You say in a high stress environment, you say it basically. And an interesting point with regards to I will come back to your thought in a second, Ben. I can see you thinking.
You can see me bouncing.
I can see you bouncing. Yeah. One thing I just hold that thought, because one thing just going through the ground school again, it's very similar to the 7.3 in this sense, is that pretty much every modern airliner, and even if you call the 737 a modern airliner, but even the 7.3, it has automatic relight function. So if the engines fail, it will automatically throw everything at it to try and restart this engine. Now, the 787 obviously is no different. It has that as well. And I looked at the conditions that needed to be met in order for the engines to try a relight. And one of them, and the main condition is that the engine's N2, which is a high pressure compressor, which spins, goes below idle. So for the auto relight to function, the engines have to roll back below idle. It doesn't cover things like a loss of thrust, but the thrust is above idle. But if we go back to your thought, I can see you.
Yeah, so I'm maybe a little bit more skeptical to interpreting too much out of a panicked Mayday call.
Sure.
Because I don't know if this is a translation.
Yeah, me too.
If someone is truly panicked, they're gonna speak in their native tongue most likely. And also under circumstances like that, I wouldn't put too much weight into it, but it is definitely an interesting observation because if it does mean that the thrust was just rolling back for whatever reason, then there's a multitude of different reasons potentially for that. But what I want to just get back to the unlikeliness of having two modern jet engines fail at exactly the same time, like for external reasons, even from bird strikes or water in the water content in the fuel, water contamination. It's almost like I have never heard of it. All right,
not simultaneously. No,
not simultaneously. That if for it to fail simultaneously, that tends to be like something has told the engines to shut off, a system fault, an electrical fault, something, whatever. But having two modern GE and X engines just spontaneously fail for whatever reason at exactly the same time is extremely unlikely.
And I think 2 points on that to go on what we already know. If it was some kind of engine failure, surge, bird strike that would cause an engine to failure, you would normally see, you would see some kind of, when you look at any kind of evidence or video of an engine failure, there's some kind of smoke or a puff or something like that. Sparks, flames. There's nothing. Everything. There's no sign of that at all.
And I think it's really important to point out here that the reason that we see it as, or at least I see it as so unlikely that this would happen, is because a jet engine is a very simple machine in its basics. Like, as long as there's fire in those burn chambers, it will continue to run unless something breaks down inside of the engine. And when it breaks down inside of the engine, let's say that you get a bird ingestion that damages the compressor stages or whatever, the way that you would see that is definitely puffs of smoke, because the air that is going through the core of the engine will be disrupted. And of course, when you have a difference in airflow and going into the burn chamber, it's now not going to be burning optimal anymore, and it's going to be pushing out this black smoke. This is why you see when you have engine searches, for example, the famous Swan song, you'll see that kind of boof, 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 and you can clearly see that happening as the engine is not feeling well.
Yeah.
But it's just like for nothing. This is it's and right. I want to get back to the misinformation, right? So I'm guessing that everyone who's listening to this are deeply interested in what could have caused this. That means that you have been out and you've been looking at YouTube, and you've been looking at X or Threads or all of these places where we tend to get our information nowadays. I have been absolutely shocked about the level of misinformation that is being sent out, and not only from like keyboard warriors who have no idea, who've flown a flight simulator once and are now coming with their theories. I am getting messages myself from friends and colleagues who are sending like, "Have you seen this? This is outrageous." And I've seen everything from clearly fake ChatGPT generated initial report, as in like preliminary report that looks and feels like a preliminary report being sent out by the Indian authorities. But when you start reading through it, it has all of the telltale signs of a ChatGPT generated text, as in like, we will be, the final report will be released next week. Those kind of things. And they send that to me, and it's like, have you checked this out? That I've never come across before. I've come across a lot of people with a lot of ideas, but having these fake things created, it's so scary, and it's so horrible against the families, because you can imagine, I mean, we are interested in this and we try to learn as much as we can about it, but can you imagine being a family member who's trying to find out what's happened to a loved one, and you finding all of these things which are blatantly untrue for a professional, but for a non-professional almost impossible to decipher.
And I think it's probably to do with the rise of AI. I mean, even when you look at the conflicts that are going on, where there's claims that F-35s have been shot down, and there's been AI images of that, and they're so out of proportion, and you can clearly see that it is it's fake. But this is new. This kind of level of AI that we're getting, where they can generate almost the quality of decent reports, is new. It wasn't there a year ago.
No. And the problem, of course, is that when it starts reaching professionals, that maybe doesn't take the time. I mean, for example, when I read these things, these are from helpful people, by the way, people who are my friends and who really dearly want to help to get the truth out there. They're sending me these things, and of course, I feel that we have a responsibility on our channels to not send out anything that is untrue if we can avoid it. So I take my time and I read through it, and I can see these things. But when the professionals start to get these things and they start to then tell their friends and family about it, it becomes truth. And it means that we are losing a possibility to learn, a possibility to make things safer. Yeah. Because it's possible that semi-professional, that glider pilot, or that general aviation pilot maybe just listen to his or her friend and didn't go much deeper than that, didn't actually read the final report when it is let out, and then believes that that it was a vapor lock on a GEnx engine. That's something that cannot happen on a GEnx engine. It's disturbing to me, and this is what I wanted to get to as well. I want to just, for all of you who are listening out there or are watching this on YouTube, The only ones that you can listen to when it comes to actually knowing what happens is the authorities that are in charge of the investigation. Everything else is information and speculation. You and I, Ben, we try to stay on the information side, which is where, like you, for example, have now spent hours going through the ground school module and telling people about the technical details. But anyone who comes out and says that, case closed, we've figured this out before even the flight data recorder has been released.
Yeah,
No.
it just, all it does is breed fear. It breeds fear because as soon as these people can be nervous, particularly after crashes, and when you start seeing these wild theories being, like a vapor lock, oh, maybe it'll happen on my airplane today, I'm going on holiday. It completely untrue, but yet it will spread fear. And I always, again, liken it to an industry that I don't really know anything about, which is the medical industry. That if I heard doctors talking about all these wild theories as to why someone that you care about is feeling poorly, you're gonna be, oh my God, this is really bad, this is awful. Whereas if you just, even if they don't know yet, just give the information that you do know factually, you can at least use that. And even like when we got a delay pedder, we're stuck in the airplane, we've got a big delay. We don't really know why, how long we're going to be stuck here yet. But if we give a bit of information over the PA system to the passengers, generally people are happy. We're all in it together. Lack of no information or incorrect information is the enemy, but factual, what we know so far, can be incredibly useful.
Yeah, now that's what I'm hoping for, and I would love to hear some feedback from you who are listening to this or watching it on YouTube. Put whatever thoughts that you have into the questions. We do read them through.
Yep.
And talking about that, actually, we've got some questions from our live stream, unsurprisingly. And there's going to continue to come questions about this. Most of them we cannot answer, but I am going to have a look now to see Spiros, our brilliant scriptwriter and researcher, have put together some that he found was interesting. So, for example, from Phantom Snipe, he's asking, can wind shear cause an incident like this?
Well, in some respects, yes, more of like a microburst. There's been instances where an aircraft has got airborne and you'll have a very strong, like a thunderstorm with a downdraft, and it's pushed an aircraft into the ground, but that's always associated with very poor weather, hail, lightning, strong winds, which just wasn't the case in that particular day. The winds were very calm. It was a very warm day. So in this scenario, I would say no.
No, exactly. You would that would become you would see the aircraft behaving differently as well. Like this was a very looked like a controlled maneuver. As in, there was no, it wasn't shaking from turbulence. It wasn't wagging from side to side. It was just kind of up and then down, and then with a very high nose towards the end.
Yeah.
So that was good question though. So then we have one that we've already touched on, and that's Ryan TGGYGH 7716. That's a mouthful of a name. Is it me, or do the flaps looks to be in the opposition on the video? Were they not configured for takeoff? That's a quick one.
Yeah, we've covered that. There's no way of knowing for sure, but yeah, we've covered that, I think, in detail already, haven't we?
Yeah, it's very hard to watch a video and see the trailing edge flaps.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a slightly longer one from E. I am a sim tech at CAE and was trying to make sense of what could possibly cause both engines to shut off or lose thrust at the same time. It must be something that they share. From what I understand, the fuel pumps are electric on the 787. Can it be possible that a loss of AC power shut off the pumps and caused the engine to shut off or lose thrust? I know the engines can be supplied with fuel through suction, but that will not be enough for takeoff when engines require lots of fuel. Loss of our electrical power will also explain the RAT deployment and hydraulic failure. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't go into the engine CBT, the fuel CBT element of the ground school, but I would imagine if it's anything like the 7.3, the engines are suction fed. They have their own suction pump that sucks fuel in. So if the pump does fail, you're still going to be able to take off safely. The only issues you might get is as you climb into the higher atmosphere, because any oxygen in there or nitrogen can kind of, a bit like undoing a bottle top in a fizzy drink. as the pressure reduces, you might get some air and some nitrogen in the fuel, which can cause problems later on. But for takeoff, that shouldn't cause a problem. There's the resiliency built into it.
Yeah, no, and as he's pointing out, I mean, you do need a lot of thrust.
Yeah.
But that just means that it's actually sucking more than
Spinning
normal.
more.
Yeah, it's spinning more. And now, I would also think that if that would be the case, and I haven't read that manual either, and the GE and X are huge engines, I would think that one of the primary things that the rat would actually do is to supply those fuel pumps. I'm not this. I have to confirm.
Yeah.
But I would be, if there would be trust issues related to potential pump failures, you would think that the rat would be supplying that.
Yeah.
You know, at least one of the pumps.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good question.
It's a great question, and you might be onto something. Again, we are going to be perfectly transparent and say that we don't know. But you are. I mean, I like the way that that you're thinking here. That is like it's something that must be affecting both engines at the same time, and fuel pumps would be affected.
They would do, because while we're on the topic of fuel contamination is one that's come up quite a bit. And the thing with fuel contamination is that we start engines, we don't start them at the same time typically. We normally start engine number 2, then we start engine 1, or vice versa. So one engine is going to be running longer than the other engine by maybe a couple of minutes, which means that engine is being fed that contaminated fuel for longer than the other one. And it takes a while to get through the system. But it would be hard to imagine where then you get airborne and both engines then flame or have a problem with that fuel at exactly the same time or a very similar time, because one's been running longer. But again,
and also the amount of water that would be needed. It would basically need to be pure water being pumped through the system, because those things burn. Like I've done videos about accidents, and I think I mentioned this in the live stream as well, where there's been fuel contamination involved, and the engines they don't just flame out; they just start acting weirdly, basically. And in the 737, at least, you also have a fuel filter. So the first indication would be potentially a fuel filter bypass warning.
Yeah.
And we show that, okay, there's something in the fuel now that shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Right, this is a really interesting one that we haven't actually touched on. So Karen Lindley 9756 is asking, also, I'm seeing footage of the crash site. There seems to be a lot of people there. Shouldn't the site be treated almost like a crime scene and cornered off? Just emergency personnel allowed? Thank you for your coverage. Appreciate that you aren't speculating, nor if it was pilot error. It's not blaming them, sadly. It's learning from them, so it never, so it doesn't have to happen again.
Yeah.
The crash scene is super interesting.
Yeah.
Because one thing that we have not touched on is the fact that this is a carbon fiber aircraft, like it's a super modern aircraft made out of carbon fiber, which means that now the crash site will. I agree with what she's saying. I mean, obviously, people are going to be there to try to help. So I would say it's normal that people are there trying to pull, survivors out of the crash site or whatever. But what you might not think about is that a body built out of carbon fiber is going to be full of carbon fibers and resin and these kind of things, which is not good to breathe.
No, especially when it's burnt.
Yeah. So the smoke from that accident was probably very, very dangerous to inhale. Now I don't know, and I haven't spoken to a doctor about this, but I do know that the accident investigation team has to work in full hazmat suits because of this. So there's no question that there is residual danger in a crash site that you probably should not subject yourself to if you're a bystander.
Yeah. And this is unique, isn't it? It's apart from the 350 that burnt. This is the first kind of composite aircraft.
I talked about that. I said it was a 787. Obviously, it was an Airbus A350, not the 787 that had the accident in Haneda Airport.
Yeah.
But yeah, apart from that, this is pretty much the only one so far.
Yeah. So it's new challenges in that sense as well. Good point.
And in any crash scene, if you are unlucky enough to end up in one, there's going to be things like, fuel, oil, skydroll, hydraulic fluid, obviously sharp things, bent metal. So, I mean, I worked as an airport firefighter for a few years, And this was definitely part of what we talked about. And obviously we were in full firefighting gear with breathing apparatus, and we had to help each other out to protect the hose, for example, to make sure it doesn't rupture when you want to go into it. There's a whole school theory around how to approach a potentially dangerous crash site. So yeah, I understand people who want to help, but if there doesn't seem to be anyone to be helped, then you should probably stay away and let the professionals handle it.
For sure.
And one thing, this is also important, one thing that you should definitely not do is to remove things from the crash site. Like, do not do that under any circumstance, because what the investigators are now going to have to do is they're going to have to pick up all of the little pieces, and they normally remove it to like a hangar somewhere, and then they start piecing the whole aircraft together again, mapping out exactly not only what pieces they've found, but also where they were found, in order to create a picture of what happened during the actual accident. So there might be something as big as a fingernail in there that turns out to be a crucial electrical component that could explain the whole accident.
Yep.
So yeah, it is kind of like a crime scene. You're absolutely right.
Yep, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think that's about it. Do you have anything else that you want to add to this?
No, other than the fact that, as you mentioned, we'll update this as we go forward and get more information. But yeah, hopefully it's something that we've got the facts here now. We can work with that. Hopefully it's something that you found useful. Feel free to keep us updated and what you think on this as well. What you draw any conclusions with, because as you mentioned, Petter, individually to speculate, go for it. But putting it out there as us, we're not going to stand here and tell you what we think happened, because it's just wrong. We don't know.
No, and we will. I can promise you that since they have the recorders, we will get to know much more detailed information, and it's likely that it's going to be something that we had no idea about.
Yep.
Something that none of us had thought about, or that Boeing hadn't thought about. And Boeing, by the way, it's obviously it's interesting. It's Paris Air Show is going on at the moment, and they are pretty much not there.
Yeah.
Like they are focusing all of their attention on this now to try to support the investigator team and find out what's happened. And again, once we get the flight data recorder, I think a lot is going to become much, much clearer, and that's going to happen much sooner than you think. And then it's going to take months. Well, probably for the initial report, for the preliminary report, it normally weeks to months, and then for the final report, years.
Yeah.
So generally 2 years or so, and then you will know exactly point to point exactly what happened.
Yeah.
So, but keep following us. I am working on a video for Mentour now as an update video. I will not release it until I know more, because it doesn't feel like I have anything to add to what other channels are already doing, and I want to make sure that what we release is as factually accurate as possible. So mentorpilot.com, we update the article there every day with new information that comes out. Airline Pilot Performance on Instagram, that's Ben's. So check that out. Obviously, I'm on Instagram as well, and I did a story yesterday where I basically said this. That people are asking me, why are you not updating? There's channels out there that are getting millions of views explaining these things, and I said, but there's very little to update.
Yeah. But we will do, as soon as facts emerge, we will update, and watch this space.
For sure. Thank you very much for listening and watching, depending on where you hear this, and we will see you next time.
Take care. Cheers.